This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
Chapter 20. Russia and the Commune. The nation of Russia developed long after Khazaria and must be studied apart from Khazaria, since it has only been in recent centuries that the two nations came into prolonged and abrasive contact. The Rus. For hundreds of years, the Rus of Scandinavia and their kinsmen traded and conquered on the rivers of Russia. They would sail the rivers from the Baltic in the northwest until they reached a point in the interior of Russia where they would beach their dragon ships. Placing them on wheels, they would have oxen drag them a relatively short distance to another Russian river flowing in the opposite direction. Launching their ships again, they sailed 2,000 miles until they reached the Black Sea. It saved the long, dangerous trip down the Atlantic, around Spain, and through the Mediterranean. Many trading posts were founded the length of the route. These Rus conquered the native Slavs instead of killing them or driving them away, and thus was born the nation of Russia, a combination of Rus master and Slav worker. Cemeteries in Moscow show a progressive broadening of skulls as racial interbreeding progressed down through the centuries. At the end, there was only the Tsar and a thin veneer of Nordic Rus aristocracy left. This was swamped in the bloody wave of the Russian Revolution. It has been estimated that 20 to 30 million Westerners were exterminated by the Slavs and Ashkenazics during and after the takeover. These deaths were accounted for by blaming them on the Germans in World War II. At the end of World War II, additional Nordic settlements were banished from Russia. Millions were herded into gulags to die. There still remains a few of our people in Russia and great numbers of mixed breeds. Since the land was no longer, quote, the land of the Rus, or Russia, the name was changed to Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The old religion was the Christian Eastern Orthodox, with the Tsar as ruler and head of the church. As is always the case, the Christian message passed from the Tsar and his priests through the Slav filter and came out Samaritan. There was little resemblance between the Christian religion practiced at the Tsar's court and that practiced in the distant Slav villages. The Samaritan religion of the villages was a composite of old Slavic beliefs in elves, fairies, and magic in a, quote, Christian wrapper. Russia is a land of few natural boundaries. There was nothing to stop the Mongols when they swept in from the east. The Mongols had only 4,000 of their own people, and so they conscripted Turks and Khazars into their forces. The Tartars and Khazars ruled the land of Rus and collected taxes in the name of the Golden Horde. Over the centuries, these invaders were pushed back. This long subjection is the reason the Soviet Slavs hate the Turks to this day, as well as distrusting the Tartars living within their borders. It is also the reason for the high feeling of the Slavs against the Khazars. The Khazarian Jews tread a very cautious path among the people they once ruled harshly in their own name and later in the name of the Mongols. The political state which developed while pushing out the Tartars resulted from the knowledge that Russia's only wall of defense is the people themselves. As land was regained, the Tsar would grant that land to one of his nobles. The noble must be able to get enough serfs, or surfing people, to occupy the land, work it, and defend it. Thus, the desperate need for Slav workers. If ever an estate stopped serving the needs of the Tsar, that estate would revert back to him. The noble owned his land in the sense that he could will it to an heir, but he was bound to give service. If a woman were an heir, she must take a husband to serve the ruler. The Tsar taxed the land to raise money for defense. The nobles, in turn, taxed the serfs. Frequent crop failures often forced the peasants to go into debt for taxes, rent, seed, and even food to live on. These debts continued to mount. In time, these debts became so heavy that many of the peasants sold themselves into slavery to cancel their debts and get themselves off the tax rolls. Slaves lived better than free men. At other times, the peasants fled the estates seeking to escape the burden of debt forced upon them. They would flee to the new estates on the ever-expanding Russian frontier. This caused conflict between the old and new nobility, because this flight of serfs from the old areas concentrated debt on those remaining. If nobles and peasants on the estates had difficulties paying their taxes and debts before the flight of some of their number, They had an impossible job with them gone. After a time, the Rus nobles passed a law which prohibited the Slav serfs from leaving the land and getting off the tax rolls. The courts authorized the return of runaways to prevent the entire political and economic system from breaking down. This is the identical thing that happened earlier in Rome. By the beginning of the 1600s, the larger part of the peasantry were slaves or near slaves. It was in this way the nation of Russia sought to ensure that its taxes would be paid, that there would be sufficient workers, and that there would be sufficient fighting men if and when the need arose. It is important to remember that the state needed defense money whether or not the landholding noble was having difficulty keeping workers. The noble had to pay taxes even if his peasants were gone. Periodically, there were tax revolts against the Tsar. The most noted was that of Pugachev in 1773, when 30,000 Slavs revolted to show their discontent, a prelude to what was to happen 146 years later. Just before our Revolutionary War in America, about 40% of the peasants belonged to the Tsar. Almost 80% of the population lived in bondage. This gives an indication of the racial breakdown of the nation. The great blow to serfdom was the defeat suffered by Russia in the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856. The system of Tsar nobles, serfs, all combined for the defense of Little Mother Russia, broke down. Theoretically, the nobles were to raise their regiments, arm and clothe them, and lead them into battle. The Russian regiments facing the Allies in the Crimea were of this kind. They were personal property of their officers. When a Russian regiment was shot to pieces in service of the Tsar, the commanding noble was economically ruined if he survived. He had no one left to work his estates and consequently could not pay the taxes. His lands could be taken from him. Many other nobles were so deeply in debt in the effort to pay taxes that they could only raise regiments but not arm or clothe them. Other nobles, fearing that the regiments would be shot up and that they would suffer financial loss, dawdled en route to the battlefields. The only system that Russia had ever known was outdated. 5 years later, the serfs were freed. The great reforms of 1861 allocated them land. It was not a gift. The Tsars took their jobs very conscientiously as head of the Christian church in Russia. As a natural consequence, the Year of Jubilee law was invoked. This Christian law orders that all debts be paid or forgiven every 7 years and that land be returned to its true owners every 50th year. While debts were not forgiven, the serfs were given 49 years to pay for their land, so that when the 50th year arrived, the land would be free from debt. The plan was to have the peasants owning their own land by 1910. The state collected the payments, which in turn paid the former landowners, who in turn could pay their own debts. The obligation for the payments was placed upon the entire peasant population of an estate commune. This method of working off debt had been customary for the past several hundred years. The commune itself, rather than the individual peasants, was given the land to manage and to allocate among its members. The hopes and expectations of the Slavic peasants knew no bounds. The system brings on revolution. Commodity prices peaked worldwide in 1864. What were reasonable prices for land in 1864 became unreasonably high prices as land and commodity prices collapsed into the Great Worldwide Depression, which did not bottom until 1896. The deeper the depression went, the lower the price received for farm produce. The less the income, the more the peasants fell behind in payment for their land. The great hopes of 1861 faded into sullen belligerency in 1896. Not all Russian peasants were in bad condition by any means. By 1905, Lenin estimated that 10.5 million peasants had small holdings that were relatively prosperous. Over 1 million had prosperous farms averaging 40 acres each. This is not much by American standards, but by Russian standards, it was head and shoulders above the bare subsistence level endured by most Russian peasants. These advances, however, were not sufficient to satisfy the great masses when confronted with increased taxes stemming from the unsuccessful Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The peasants and communes, finding it impossible to pay interest, current taxes, land payments, and rents, still had to find enough to feed their families. They revolted when the cost of the war was added. This was the revolt of 1905. The land situation in Russia at this time was as follows. The Tsar, who was the government, was the most extensive landowner, as is the case in all nations. The church was next largest. As in other lands, the devout through the generations had willed their lands to the church. Unlike the marshes, woods, and steppes, which comprised most of the Tsar's land, church land was mostly prime acreage. The remainder of the land was owned half by nobles and half by peasants. The Great Emancipation of 1861, with a plan for land ownership free of debt by 1910, set the stage for the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918. What started as a generous idealistic gesture turned out to be a nightmare as land and commodity prices tumbled lower and lower. There was no way most peasants were going to get their land. The Tsar, who was the government, owed exorbitant loans to the European Khazarian bankers. There was abundant collateral, but there was no way to foreclose. While it is true that the borrower is servant to the lender, the problem of the creditors foreclosing can be difficult, especially when the debtor has an army and the creditor has none. The Tsar, the church, and the nobility certainly were not going to give up easily their possessions to satisfy their Ashkenazic creditors. They would fight first.